Director of Operations for the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. And I just wanted to give you just a little bit of information about UJE before I introduce our speaker. UJE was started 10 years ago by a small group of people from Canada and the US who all believed in the need to bring together both communities in a respectful way. It was incorporated, or became a legal body, in 2009, and then established as a not-for-profit Canadian charitable organization about 2014. We have a board of directors, an advisory board, and an academic council, and you can find that on our website, and also I have brochures here. And we've made many inroads over the past 10 years. We've had academic roundtable discussions by scholars from around the world, looking at the history of the relationship between both communities on the territory of Ukraine. And the discussions have been held in Salzburg, London, Israel, Berlin, Potsdam, and the next one is going to be held this year in the United States. And that will be looking at the post-World War II up to independence. We've created and also participated in major conferences in Ukraine. We had a conference called Ukraine Thinking Together that brought many experts and global thinkers to examine Ukraine's history and current status. We had a conference on propaganda, which is a hot topic now, bringing journalists and historians together to examine how propaganda influenced and is influencing how we perceive each other. And we were involved in a major commemoration for the 75 years of Babin Yar in Kyiv, Ukraine for 1 week. And that included youth workshops, public forums, films, and a concert that was designed, developed, and for the commemoration of Babin Yar. We've held panel discussions at many book fairs in Ukraine, panel discussions at Limmud in 5 countries, published 3 major publications. One is entitled Jews and Ukrainians, and we have one copy here. Natalia? You could just show them. And this is the book that will be discussed later today. You could just show them. And one on Babin Yar, and one on cultural dimensions. We also assisted with publications of many other books that other people were publishing that were looking at the vision that we had for Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. We've also produced a documentary about Metropolitan Shadursky and his selfless success in hiding several hundred Jewish children during World War II. We created the Shadursky Award and presented it to individuals that positively influence relationships between Jews and Ukrainians, and the awards have been presented to James Timotei, who is currently our chair, Victor Pinchuk, and Ivan Zhuba. We've created and shown an exhibit across Canada about Ukrainian Jewish relations from antiquity to 1914. And we've now established an office in Kyiv with a regional manager, Ukraine. Over the next couple of years, we are now developing a new image for all our promotional materials that reflect the changes that have been made to our website. And if you go on our website, it's a brand new website, and I think you'll find it very informative. And we've also are creating a teaching manual for public and high school students about the life and work of Metropolitan Shadursky. And we're working on a fundraising project in Canada to raise monies in 2018 for a hospital in Kyiv to deal with rehabilitation and trauma for soldiers and their families to help them back into society with a positive purpose. We're also creating a world-class museum exhibit which will be shown at the Royal Ontario Museum. We think it'll be early 2019, which will examine the life between Jews and Ukrainians on the territory of Ukraine from antiquity to present day. And this exhibit will also travel to other countries. Through all the work that's been done, we know that through the thousands of years of living side by side, we have many similarities influenced by one another in art, music, and food. And in the cafe area, you'll see our banner on food that shows the comparison of the same foods that we have and that have influenced each other. And this was really emphasized during the Revolution of Dignity on the Maidan, where all the peoples of Ukraine, no matter what their religion or background, stood side by side, and they won. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Yars Balan is an author. Hello. Whoops. Yars Balan is an author, editor, and literary translator who has published numerous scholarly and journalistic works on Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Canadian themes. Since 2000, he has served as a coordinator of the Kuhl Ukrainian-Canadian Studies Center for the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Born and raised in the Bathurst Manor District in North York, he's a graduate of William Lyon Mackenzie Collegiate and the Universities of Toronto and Alberta. His areas of academic specialty are Ukrainian-Canadian history, literature, and theater. In this capacity, over the years, he has written works on a number of Ukrainian Jewish themes, including an essay on the anarchist Makhnovist movement, published in the collection A Sharing of Diversities, Proceedings of the Jewish Mennonite Ukrainian Conference, Building Bridges, and most recently an article for the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter about the friendship between the renowned painter William Kurylik and his art dealer, Arv Isaacs. Yars first learned about Rhea Clyman from research done on a coverage in the Canadian press dealing with the 1932-33 famine created by Joseph Stalin's policies, focusing in particular how these affected Soviet Ukraine. Of special interest are Rhea Clyman's reports as the Moscow correspondent for the London Daily Express and the Toronto Telegram, and the 22 articles that she wrote about a 3,000-mile road trip that took her through the famine lands of eastern Ukraine and the North Caucasus in the late summer of 1932. Rhea Clyman immigrated to Canada from Poland as a 2-year-old with her family and grew up in Toronto near the corner of Bay and Dundas. Yars learns more and more about this outstanding woman as he tells her story in various cities and comes into contact with her relatives that are in Canada and the United States. Her story is fascinating, and Yars just might be developing a historic crush. Please join me in welcoming Yars Balan.
Thank you. So Raya told you a little bit about how I came to Rhea Clyman. Specifically, our institute was involved in writing a history of Ukrainians in Canada in the interwar period, 1924 to 1939-40. And of course, smack dab in the middle of that, 32-33, you have the Great Famine or Holodomor in Ukraine. And so I asked myself the question, what did ordinary Canadians know about what was going on in the Soviet Union in general and in Ukraine at that time? Because the perception in the Ukrainian community is that the Soviets had done such a good job of suppressing information that people only found out about the famine decades later, after the Second World War, when people who immigrated from refugees who got out from eastern Ukraine were able to tell their stories. We are shocked to find out that isn't true. There was lots of coverage, tons of coverage about the Soviet Union. There was an intense curiosity, especially during the 5-year plan, the first 5-year plan of Stalin's. It's not unusual in the Toronto Star, for instance, to have 5, 7, 9 news items, whether it's a front page news story, very often front page news story. We're talking stories that sometimes ran 1,500, 2,000 words. An editorial, letters to the editor, opinion pieces, little short news items, human interest stories. There was lots of coverage about, and a real variety of coverage. Within that, there was some very good coverage and analysis of what was going on with the food situation, with the agricultural situation, with the climate of fear, all of the horrible things that were happening. But there were also stories that spun everything in a positive direction. The 5-year plan was a great success. They even reprinted articles from the Soviet press that, of course, rattled off reams and reams of statistics about how many tons of coal and how many, how they increased this and that, portraying this very glowing account of the success of the 5-year plan. What the obvious intent of all this is the Soviet Union was kind of a leaky sieve. You couldn't contain all that information within the Soviet Union. It got out. It's too big a country. There are too many people moving around. It was impossible to totally suppress it. But what they did succeed in doing, at least as far as Soviet propaganda was concerned, was they created doubt. So, and you see this in a variety of ways. So you have the editor of the publisher of the Vancouver Sun, who went to Moscow in 1933 in March, April, and spent 2 weeks there. And of course, he was so impressed about how, oh, they're building everything, and it looks like, you know, yes, people are shabbily dressed, yes, the housing is terrible and everything, but, you know, yes, the people in the morning were lining up, you know, not up for food, but to get their newspaper at the local kiosk. They're building everywhere, and this is the future, and that the West had better get used to it, because the Soviets are surging ahead, and they're going to bear, you know, basically implying that they were going to outstrip the West in terms of development. You had also people writing letters to the editor saying, we don't know what to believe. Oh, and this is the interesting thing that he said. He said, people in Moscow were talking that there was a famine in Ukraine, but I heard also as well that people in Ukraine said that there was a famine in Moscow. Will you decide? And he just sort of threw his hands up. This is a man who then came back and spoke, you know, in Saskatoon and in Winnipeg and Toronto, you know, gave several talks at Rotary clubs and things like that about his trip and all these wonderful revelations he had about the Soviet Union, and things were really surging ahead there and very positive. So you have people like that. But you also have, so you have people writing letters to the editor who say, we don't know what to believe. These guys say it's horrible there, these guys say it's wonderful, you know. And they, in that sense, Soviet propaganda succeeded because it cast a doubt over the veracity of the accurate reports and gave credibility to inaccurate reports. I'm going to tell you about Rhea Clyman, who is really remarkable for telling the truth about what went on. And one of the titles that I use for my talk is, Truth Doesn't Matter, Is It Constructive? This is a cynical remark of a Soviet censor named Neumann, who you know, sneered at her when she was going on this trip. And you know, they had this discussion or whatever, and you could see that, you know, it doesn't matter what you write or whatever, it's irrelevant. And the other quote I use is, tell the world outside so others may know. And I'll explain how where that quote came from in one of her articles. So just a bit about Rhea's background. Raya told you a little bit about her. The family emigrated from Polonetsk, Poland. This is south-central Poland in the Malopolska region, and came to Canada in 1906. There were 3 brothers. Jack, who was born in 1900. David, who was born in 1902, Raya was born in 1904. Another 3 children were born in Canada. One thing about her childhood, it was rough. And in your handout there's a picture of the street where she grew up in Toronto. And what you need to do is just look at the houses there. I mean, they lived in shacks almost, you know, outdoor cans in the back. But they're poor immigrants, struggling, had nothing when they came. Things were made worse when in 1910, at a Victoria Day parade, Rhea were in the crowds and everything like that, Rhea fell under a streetcar, and she had a leg, she lost a leg. It had to be amputated when she was 6 years old. She was in and out of hospital for several years, but she was tough. She was really tough. And it was in hospital that she was visited by a man who was an editor at the Toronto Telegram, who asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. She said she wanted to be a journalist. And he encouraged her. He even gave her a Bible. He gave her a Bible at one point and said, read this, you've got everything you need to know about writing is in here. And but when she was 11 years old, her father passed away, and Rhea had to go work in a factory. So her formal schooling ended. And what she did then was that she started to go to, she went to courses, night courses, and she was practical. She took secretarial courses, business courses. And so by the time she was 18, 20, she was already working as a secretary and helping to support the family with her older brothers and support their widowed mother. She makes a reference to attending some classes at the University of Toronto. I checked with them and they didn't have any record of her being enrolled there. She might have just been auditing some courses or anything like that, but she was determined and she self-educated her. She pursued a course in self-education. In 1925, she decides to move to New York, manages to get a job with a psychoanalyst. I figure she must have been a receptionist or anything. I don't think she was working psychoanalyzing people. She did that for a couple of years, and then she got a chance to work with the Agent General for the province of Alberta in London, England, because the provinces, as now, some of them have offices in different countries where they want to promote tourism, investment, business, whatever. She got this wonderful job. She goes to London, she lived there for a year, But her real goal, she wanted to be a journalist. And she wanted to go to the Soviet Union because, of course, the Soviet Union was where the revolution had happened. They were building this exciting new society. It was a worker state. People were equal. Women had equal rights to men. There was no unemployment. It was a terrific place. She had to see this place. To get there, though, she had to go first to France, and she studied French at the Sorbonne for 3 months. She had got a student visa or whatever, but she also enabled her to work. And so she taught English to pay for her learning French. When her visa expired, she moved on to Germany. Now this is 1928, and Hitler had made the Nazis had made their first bid for power and had failed. But it was a very, pressure cooker atmosphere, clashes between the communists and the National Socialists. It was a very charged situation, but she thought it was a great opportunity to witness firsthand and prepare herself for journalism. While she was there, she gets a note from she contacted the Soviet embassy, who informed her that the visa that she had applied for in London had come through. And she was thrilled. Now, I've since learned there's an article published recently in a Journal of Intelligence, MI5 stuff in Britain, and there was an article how Rhea's name came up in intercepts of communications between communist activists, and so they said that they were convinced that she was a courier for the Communist Party. There's a good chance she joined the Communist Party. This was not unusual for young, idealistic people of her generation, and that this probably helped her get into the Soviet Union. She, when she got her visa, she had the exact sum of 15 pounds sterling, or about 75 bucks, to her name. She got on the train on December 23rd, 1928 in Berlin, and goes to Moscow not speaking Russian, not knowing a soul, not having a hotel or in a place to stay, nothing. This is just an indication of the kind of character she had. She gets off the train in Moscow, she's wandering around the train station, somebody sees this woman saying, well, this guy spoke maybe 3 words of English, but he figured out she needs help, steered her to the Grand Hotel across the street, and they introduced her to Negley Farson's wife. Negley Farson was a Chicago Daily News reporter who was living there with his wife and was reporting from the Soviet Union. She spent the first night sleeping in their bathtub. Very quickly they arranged through a Society of Friends, Quakers, who had some groups there, and they found a place for her to stay temporarily. And within a few days she was hired by Walter Duranty of the New York Times. Walter Duranty is infamous in history, certainly in Ukrainian history, as the reporter from the Soviet Union who spun a lot of lies, who knew what was going on, who privately said one thing and published other things about the Soviet Union, for which he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize. She worked for him for 9 months, used the time to pick up Russian, and I think coming from a Polish background, I'm sure at home they probably spoke Polish, and then the part of Poland they lived in was also under the Russian Empire earlier, so they might have spoken Russian too. But she picked up Russian well enough that she was able to move around on her own. She also learned enough to be able to then start to offer her services as a correspondent, a journalist for other newspapers, a stringer. And the London Daily Express started publishing some of her articles and agreed to take her on. And there's an interesting Canadian connection because it was owned by Lord Beaverbrook. Max Aitken, who was born just north of Toronto and was a press baron. And this was at a time when the London Daily Express had the largest circulation in the world of a newspaper. It was huge. So getting in there was a great thing. But she was never a formally, like, it wasn't that they sent her as a correspondent. She, she submitted articles, some published, some not. Initially, I think that she was caught up with the enthusiasm for the Soviet Union, for what she saw, but I think gradually she came to understand that this was a horror story that was unfolding before her eyes. One of the things that probably opened her eyes up was she had a Russian boyfriend, and he got arrested for changing valuta, foreign currency, rubles for foreign currency on the black market, and he got arrested and sent to 3 years in prison in the far north, or in Siberia somewhere. It's hard to tell when she first began getting a byline, because a lot of her articles, I think, were published without any, just saying in Moscow correspondent London Daily Express, whatever. We have found one article in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix from 1931. It's the first one that I've seen that was published under her name. But it really wasn't until 1932 that she sort of gets a byline. And it comes when she decides in the summer of 1932 to make this trip to the far north to see what these labor camps are like, where political prisoners were sent and were, you know, being exploited as slave labor by the regime. She went to Leningrad, and in Leningrad, this woman became extremely well connected. She describes in one of her articles how Michael Kalinin, the prime minister of the Soviet Union, drove her home in his car after some event. She met Alexandra Kollontai, the feminist, a member of the Soviet government, you know, leading feminist activist in the Soviet Union. She also met George Bernard Shaw when he came to the Soviet Union in 1931 in Leningrad, and interviewed him for an article that was supposed to be published in the London Daily Express. We went through the Daily Express through that period, and it looks like it wasn't accepted for one reason or another. They printed other articles that weren't very flattering of Mr. Shaw, who of course was quite an idiot, who thought that Mussolini and Hitler were impressive, and Stalin was impressive. He loved dictators for some reason, and she wasn't too impressed with him. And unfortunately, I'd love to see what her interview was like. It would have been interesting to see, but it's been lost. Anyways, in the summer of 1932, and just before she leaves on it, she has an article published in Maclean's magazine. Now, you all know Maclean's. It's still around all these years later. Russia's New Woman. And it was basically about the situation of women in the Soviet Union. And I'll read you just a little clip of what she wrote about them. This is an anecdote that she relates in her article. The position of women in Russia, a middle-aged woman remarked bitterly, is first in the queues and last on the bus. She carried 2 large wicker baskets with potatoes and frozen cabbage. Every time the bus lurched, she was flung off her feet and vegetables rolled in all directions, but no one offered her a seat. I've been up since 6, she continued, after I had persuaded her to put one basket in the aisle to leave a hand free for a strap, but no one offered her a seat. Rushing about all over town to get these, pointing to the baskets. There are no vegetables in the shops now, and I have to go to the Borota market to get them. I've still got dinner to cook and the washing to do before my husband gets up. It's my free day also. So they had a free day, and of course, husband gets to sleep in. And then, free day, an equally laden young woman retorted hotly. Free for the men. They sleep or are off to their svidanias, their rendezvous, looking menacingly at the row of seated men, 2 of whom managed to blush. They're off to their svidanias, she repeated more loudly, and their wives slave at home. She was a feminist, obviously, and everywhere she went, that was one of the interesting things about her reports, is she talks about, okay, you write about the miners and their dangerous jobs and the dirty conditions. She goes and visits a miner's wife who's living with 4 kids on the 4th floor of a building without an elevator or anything, no plumbing still, no running hot water or anything like that. She says, where's the washroom? And they just out back, you know, just out in the back 40 sort of thing, and with 4 kids. So you can imagine, I mean, she made a point of always describing, finding out what the conditions were like for women. She makes this trip to the far north. She goes to a place called Petrozavodsk in Karelia, the capital of Karelia, and there were Finnish and there were Finnish colonies there established by communists who had been in Canada and the United States and who saw this exciting new revolutionary society they wanted to build. Well, they went there. Their conditions weren't great, but compared to everybody else, actually they were much better because they had some Western cash and people sent them things. They were able to shop in the Torkson stores, the special stores where you have to pay for things in foreign currency. But the most important thing she did was she managed to make it to a city where foreign journalists were not allowed, Kemp. This was on the White Sea. And this was basically the administrative center and the supply center for the Solovets Island prison camp. This is a notorious prison camp that goes back to Tsarist times, a monastery that then became a camp or whatever, and she wanted to get onto the island. She takes the train in, and even though without permission, she got off the train managed to pull out, and it doesn't come every day sort of thing, so she She was thrilled that she had sort of pulled this off. And again, this is the type of person she was. She goes up to a soldier, who's a militiaman, who's standing there, and she needs to get downtown. The train station's quite a bit out of town, and every time a bus comes, it's packed with people, and she's, she can't get on that quickly. So eventually, the GPU guy, the secret police guy at the station, sort of says, well, get a wagon, gets a wagon, commandeers it, and gets her to a hotel. She goes into a hotel, and this is the first thing that I want to just read you from. And it's an article that she wrote called "The Town of Living Corpses Turns Out to See Drama When Exiles Meet Wives." When she comes into the hotel, she sees this woman, a cleaning lady downstairs, kind of very downtrodden looking. She says, "Where's the dejurna? Where's the woman who, manages the place?" She says, "Well, she's upstairs folding linen. Could you go get her?" So she shows her a room, and the room is, the bed is like this, the window's broken, it's dusty. But it's a room. Compared to some of the other places that she had to sleep, this was actually pretty good. She says, great, it's fine. The cleaning lady comes up. It was only after she had taken his, so the young man who was accompanying her left. It says, only after he had taken his departure and the grim-faced housekeeper was spreading fresh, clean linen on my bed that I realized I had accomplished the impossible. Gate crashed chem. The last train gone an hour ago, and found a clean room for the night. I felt exultant and broke into laughter. One look at the horrified face of the woman and every trace of fun in me died out. What have I done? I asked hurriedly. You were laughing, she replied. I've been in this town 3 years and I've never heard anyone laugh before. We Russians have forgotten how. This is the town of the Живой труп, living corpses. Write this, you are a journalist. Tell the world outside so others may know. And with this she walked out. I was awed into silence. Quickly the gloom and fear that hung over Kem settled on me. Even the gay sunshine streaming into my room could not lift it. So I'm here to fulfill her job of telling the world about it, because she then decided that's what she was going to do. She wrote a series of articles in Kem. She then went further north to a mining community where exiles were put to work in mines. They were living in tents in the winter, summer, basically in canvas rooms or whatever, packed in. Disease, a whole bunch of them died, and children died of dysentery and other diseases when they first moved there. And they're working in an apatite mine, and it's phosphorus, something that you use for fertilizer. She goes to Murmansk by boat to Arkhangelsk, and she comes back. So this is an incredible journey that she made in a train, by train. She did manage in Kem to interview the commandant, the OGPU commandant of the Solovetsky Island camp, who basically said, you're not supposed to be here. And she said, I want to go see the camp. He said, no, he bought her lunch, and where he ate, it was a nice place, and it was good food compared to everywhere else that she ate. And, but that, when she wrote these articles, she got back to Moscow, and she managed to smuggle out this series of articles written at Kem, and they were published shortly after. In the meantime, these two women from Atlanta, Georgia, who were society girls, and who wanted to, like a lot of young people, the Soviet Union is where it's at, all these exciting things happening, women are equal, all this, no unemployment. So they got a car and they drove around Europe, Western Europe. They managed to drive into Moscow, but they wanted to make this grand trip all the way down to the Caucasus and through to the stands, well, to Georgia and Armenia and places like that. They needed somebody to go with them as an interpreter and a guide, and they ended up getting Rhea. So these three women pile into a car packed with food, as much food as they could carry, water, gas, a stove that they could cook on or whatever, and began on this incredible journey. South from Moscow, they spent the first night at Yasnaya Polyana in the Tolstoy's estate. They arrive in Kharkiv, and the Kharkiv one is an interesting one, where all the way down they're describing what they had seen. Now in your handout you'll see a map of their journey here, and before I get this here, this is when they arrived. So they're in Kharkiv. We had been 2 days in Kharkiv, but we were all anxious to get away. The great Ukrainian capital was in the grip of hunger. Beggars swarmed around the stores. the streets. The stores were empty. The workers' bread rations had just been cut from 2 pounds per day to 1 pound and a quarter. A young Ukrainian girl, Alice Murtska, had come begging to our hotel for food. She had lived in New Toronto, Long Branch, for 9 years. Her father worked at the Massey Harris Company. 3 years ago, she and her father came to Russia to get work at the tractor plant in Kharkiv. Now we're without bread, she told me. So this is a factory that was built under the 5-year plan, right? You know, and it was supposed to be producing 1,000 tractors a month or whatever, and it's producing maybe 100. The place is a mess. They visited the tractor factory, and she describes it and says, like, there's a dump. And she says, now where's the place to eat? Because they hadn't had anything to eat. They needed to leave town after, and they sort of said, well, it only opens, and it's, you know, it's for American workers who are there as technical experts and whatever. So they left town without getting any food. And they drive south from Kharkiv, and they drive past all these villages that she points out are empty. She says, you know, the doors are sort of flapping and the curtains are flapping in the breeze. And she goes, oh, this is where these kulaks, these peasants that had been exiled to the far north, some of whom she saw in Hibinodorsk in the far north, or in Siberia. And finally they drive and they see a village where there's a little bit of activity to drive in. These women have a little market, and they're selling stuff, or they're selling stuff from their gardens. And she goes up and starts talking to them, and of course she speaks Russian, and they only spoke Ukrainian, and they didn't understand Russian, which is an interesting, now every Ukrainian in Ukraine understands Russian. These women in the villages didn't. Finally some young boy who spoke both languages was the interpreter. She said, we want to buy some milk and some eggs. And they sort of like, there's no milk or eggs here. I mean, all the livestock has been killed. The chickens, there's nothing like that here. And one woman said, well, you know, I live in a village just a little bit way back from here. I might be able to scare something up there. So she gets in the car, they drive in. And when they drove in, this is what she saw. When we arrived at the next village, men, women, children, and shaggy coats all came crowding out of the narrow doorways. They wanted something of me, but I could not make out what it was. At last, someone went off for a little crippled lad of 14, and when he came hobbling up, the mystery was explained. This was the village of Isyumka, the lad told me. I was from Moscow, yes. We were a delegation studying conditions in the Ukraine, yes. Well, they wanted me to take a petition back to the Kremlin from this village, and the one I had just been in. Tell the Kremlin we are starving, we have no bread. We are good, hard-working peasants, loyal Soviet citizens, but the village Soviet has taken our land from us. We are in the collective farm, but we do not get any grain. Everything, land, cows, and horses have been taken from us, and we have nothing to eat. Our children were eating grass in the spring. I must have looked unbelieving at this, for a tall, gaunt woman started to take the children's clothes off. She undressed them one by one, prodded their sagging bellies, pointed to their spindly legs, ran her hand up and down their tortured, misshapen, twisted little bodies to make me understand that this was real famine. I shut my eyes. I could not bear to look at all this horror. Yes, the woman insisted, and the boy repeated, they were down on all fours like animals eating grass. There was nothing else for them. Now, what you should know is that the famine conditions, this is actually just the lead up to the famine. The famine broke out already in the spring of 1932. It was eased somewhat in the summer when people could live off their gardens. And then, but these people knew that they were not going to survive the winter if they didn't get food. That they, you know, they could live off their produce from their gardens for a couple of months, but then what? And so they knew what was facing them. In actual fact, I mean, demographers have now been able to establish that minimum of about 3.5–4 million Ukrainians died directly of famine in 1932–33. The bulk of them between January 1933, so after this village, between January 1933 and June, it's estimated that about 25,000 people a day were dying of hunger. Now, this doesn't count the people who were shot, this doesn't count people who were deported, this doesn't count the people who died young because their health was compromised by, you know, they survived the famine and died in 1934 or 1935 or 1936, died prematurely. This doesn't count the unborn children that weren't born because of the situation. So what she was describing was really one of the first accounts of the early stages of the famine. Rhea got through all of the, she traveled, I said, through the coal mining districts. She described conditions there in the Caucasus, in an area that was very heavily settled by Ukrainians. the Kuban region. She describes how there were watchtowers in the fields, on the corners of fields with guys with guns, and that people are monitoring day and night to make sure nobody stole any grains of wheat. And they made it all the way to Georgia. And I'll end my remarks here to give you some time to ask a few questions. She gets to, they get to Georgia after many other adventures, which I won't go into, but they check into the hotel, and when they're coming checking in, they say there's 2 men upstairs who want to see you. And Rhea had already sort of knew the lay of the land, sort of like, oh, this doesn't sound good. She goes up there, and it was the OGPU telling her that she had 24 hours to leave the country, because on September 17th, 1932, by decree of the Politburo, the highest level of government in the Soviet Union, so this is the kind of importance attached to it, she was banished from the country, deported for writing false news about Russia, and for spreading lies about the nationalization of women. Now, this is a totally made-up, fabricated thing. She did not talk about women being nationalized. But the order came down, and she responded by saying, well, I got 2 hours to leave. I says, I'm not going anywhere. And they said, the Iranian border's here. I said, no, I'm not going to Iran. I mean, my stuff is in Moscow. She dug her heels in, so while they were figuring out what to do, she managed to storm out and went down to the German consulate and got the German diplomats to telegraph the British embassy, or they decided they telegraphed the German thing in code to have them call the British embassy and let them know that she was being detained and to be deported. Next thing you know, she insisted, she said, I want to see the senior, I don't deal with you guys, low-level OGPU guys. So they send over a guy, and she wanted to make sure that her message got through. So she leaves, and they say, you can't go. She says, what do you mean? I'm a foreigner, and I have papers to be here. I'm a journalist. I'm a British subject. You can't detain me. So sort of like, we're the OGPU. We can do whatever we want. We don't. As she's marching to go to the German consulate, I mean, there's an AGPU agent sticking his gun in her side as they're walking down the street, and she's just like, going like this. She eventually stops. They go back, but her message to get through. She was then allowed to return to Moscow. It was a 5-day train trip. Now, she was pretty worn out. You can imagine from this road trip. In the newspaper, it says 5,000 miles. It wasn't. It was about 2,500 miles, but still an incredible piece of, to think about what it was like traveling in a lot of places on dirt tracks. There were no maps. They were chased by bandits in the Caucasus. I mean, these women had one hell of an adventure. But she got back to Moscow. She had 2 days to pack up her belongings. There's an interesting account of a famous British journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge, who also wrote about the famine. He had just arrived in the Soviet Union, and he visited her as she was packing up and given a little interesting description, a little vignette. She lived with a Russian family. This is one thing that she wasn't paid big bucks like the real correspondent. She was just a stringer. She rented a room in an apartment. There were 8 children in 2 rooms beside her, shared washroom, shared kitchen, whatever, tiny little apartment. But they were thrilled to have her because she had money. She was relevant, she could shop in stores they couldn't, she could get things she couldn't, and so when she came back, they were really upset that they were going to lose her, right? They had formed a very close relationship with her and everything. Anyway, she got kicked out. Her expulsion was a major international news story. It was covered in New York, well, in all the Canadian newspapers, I found from the Montreal Gazette and Ottawa Citizen, the Star, the Telegram, the Globe, the Winnipeg Free Press, the Winnipeg Tribune, Saskatoon Star Phoenix, Regina Thing, Medicine Hat, Vancouver Sun, Vancouver Province. All of them carried reports about her being expelled. She was the first Western journalist to be kicked out of the Soviet Union in 11 years. It was carried in the Boston Globe, in the New York Times, in dozens of American newspapers around the country. It was carried in the Hungarian press, the British press, the French press, the Polish press, Dutch press. I mean, I've got press reports from all these places, Singapore thing. This was a big news story. She came out, and After she got out, she wrote a series of articles that appeared in the a couple of articles that appeared in the London Daily Express about this second trip through Ukraine and to the Caucasus. But when she came out, she came back to Toronto, and she ended up writing 22 articles about this trip that she made through what she called the Famine lands. They earlier printed a series of 21 articles about the trip that she made to the far north, where she described in great detail all the things that she experienced there. We're talking about front page news stories and everything. And in here you've got a picture of or a reprint of the front page of the Toronto Telegram when she was kicked out. This was a big, big deal. Just to finish up her story, and this is work for somebody, maybe somebody here who's listening can follow up with this. Rhea goes back in November of 1933 to Europe and immediately goes to Germany, where she became a reporter for the London Daily Telegraph, a different newspaper in Britain. And she was in Munich, Germany from November of 33 till the summer of 1938. Think about this, a Jewish woman who is reporting from the belly of Nazi Germany. And they knew she was Jewish, but this was not a secret. She was lucky to get out when she did. She flew out in 1938 with a group of refugee Jewish children to Amsterdam in a plane, and the plane crashed. She survived the crash, broke her tailbone or something like that, recovered for several months in England, and then came back to Canada. She was in Canada until 1942. She moved to the United States in 42, and she kind of sort of disappears, and she pops up in a few places. She ended up working for McCann Erickson Advertising Agency in New York for a while. She worked for Reuters. I checked with Reuters again. They didn't have any records of her. I checked with McCann Erickson in their archive. They didn't have any records of her employment there, but she's mentioned in a book that came out in 1967 where they printed an article by her about describing how she thwarted or delayed the annexation of Austria by the Germans, the Anschluss, because she wrote several articles exposing how the Germans were preparing to annex Austria, and the Germans backed off, and it was 2 years later before they finally did it. She died in New York City in 1981. We don't know, I know where she was living. There was no mention of her death in the New York Times or anywhere else, which is unusual. I mean, she was single. She was not wealthy, certainly, though she did leave some money to one relative in Toronto, which was a surprise to find out, and they were surprised to find out. But that's, I said, Rhea's story is still being told. I'm working on a documentary film about her life in the Soviet Union. But I said there's a whole chapter, a book to be written about her time in Nazi Germany and what she reported on there. But it means going through the newspapers day by day and pulling all of her articles or trying to identify as many of them by her to find out her reports. But she really was a remarkable woman that all Canadians should know about. Ukrainians, Jews. I think women's studies is of, she's of interest to women's studies. I think she's of interest to people in the media. So, I'll end my remarks there. If you have any comments or questions, I'll be happy to respond.
I have one, and that is, considering what Durante was writing and what she was writing, did they ever clash or get into any kind of debate?
It's unclear. She she does make a reference to Walter Durante in an article that appeared in 1961 in the Toronto Telegram. Some of you are older, if you grew up in Toronto, will remember the Pink Deli. We were subscribers, and I used to deliver the Star. But in 1961, the Telegram correspondent to Moscow was kicked out. And they must have gone through the files, and they got a hold of Rhea in New York and interviewed her and wrote an article about it. And she mentions Durante, and Durante, she laughingly just sort of says, well, Durante always said that nobody's going to care, nobody's going to read any of this stuff anyway. Like, it's basically making a joke of it, that it doesn't matter what we write in the end. That's not true. I disagree totally with that. Like, I disagree with a lot of things with Walter Durante, but that's the only reference that we have, so I don't know what the relationship was like. Durante was also, I think, a ladies' man and everything. Who knows what it was like working for him. He probably was a creep. Malcolm Muggeridge was, which has also come out. And you have to remember, a lot of these journalists in those days were hard drinking, a lot of them were alcoholics and everything. I would just say that as well that she wasn't the only Canadian journalist there. It's astounding to me how many Canadians were in the Soviet Union in 1932-33 traveling around. There were two journalists, one who started with the Globe and jumped to the Star, and the other one who was sent by the Star. They wrote like 40 articles, and again, we're talking 1,200, 1,500, 1,800 words, front page into the thing, you know, every 2 days an article. And they were in the places, they were in Kharkiv. They visited the same, all three of them visited the same tractor factory that she visited in Kharkiv within a couple months. It's fascinating to see how different their accounts are. She describes it as it was a dump. And I think that she was expelled as a message, sending a message to foreign correspondents. You cross certain lines. You could criticize certain things. Of course, you couldn't criticize the senior leadership of the party. You could criticize the kulaks for sabotage. You could criticize overzealous local officials. There's certain things you could say, but she obviously crossed the line, and they needed to make an example of her. They were clearly watching her. They watched everybody, and so they probably knew that this is a woman who had lost the rosy glow, or the rose-tinted glasses had fallen off. But there were other Canadian journalists who went. There were also delegations that went. Some of the most interesting account, the Telegram carried in 1932 18 articles by an engineer from Toronto who worked in various projects in the Soviet Union, and he described, he says, it's a disaster. The 5-year plan is chaos, it's a failure. The place is collapsing, right? There's no food to eat. So these reports are carried in the press, but you also had reports about how the 5-year plan was this huge success. They had built so many factories. They had collectivized so many farms. They had, it was all wonderful. And so you get these jarring sort of contradictory accounts appearing in the press throughout this period. But that's another aspect that I'm looking at, is just the general Canadian coverage to compare, because she stands out. I mean, she's obviously somebody that, and her credibility, she'd been there 4 years. It's not somebody who came in for 2 months or 6 weeks or did a quick trip and was shown all these model farms and model factories. She knew where the crap was. So. Yeah.
Is there anything to be said about her Jewishness? Or did
yes.
she say anything about
well, the sense I get is that the family wasn't deeply religious. There is one reference I've come across when she was 23 years old in Toronto. She attended a function at one of the Zionist halls downtown organized by the Hadassah Society, and she's just listed as being there. But I think, the family was really poor, and, going to synagogue and being active in the Jewish community was not really possible at that stage in their lives. And so she, and I don't, I wouldn't be surprised if, I don't know, she might have just been cremated. Who knows? We're trying to find her grave in New York, if she's buried there. We're wondering how all of it ended, and nobody, that I've been able to talk to in the family or anything, people can't help me with that. So we're trying to dig out, see if we can get a death certificate for her and find out where she might be buried, because she really should, if she's in an unmarked grave, there should be a grave marker for this woman. She really was a special individual. Yes?
And following that we were reading about the report, is there how you came to the story? What's your passion?
Well, I said I work at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and my job is researching the history of Ukrainians in Canada. We were working on a history of Ukrainians in Canada during the interwar period, which includes the period of the famine. And we wondered what Canadians knew about what was going on in Soviet Ukraine at that time. And one of the things I did was I hired two grad students at Trent University to go through the Toronto Telegraph, because the Toronto Star and the Globe are available searchable databases. We went through the Winnipeg Free Press, a whole bunch of newspapers. But yeah, this is like sitting at a microfilm page by page by page. And one of them caught a few of her articles in her series about the famine. And as soon as I saw it, I said, man, this is incredible. So then we hired a real scholar or whatever, who then went through and culled a wealth of information, and then that started us. I just finished. I just had another student go through the London Daily Express and found a bunch of articles that I didn't have. I had a few that came to me through a different source, and so we're filling out the picture of her reports there. But it's been a gradual process of piecing together her life.
Did you want to introduce her relatives?
Ted and Terry Shipper are here, and Ted, why don't you tell them your connection? And he met Rhea on a couple of occasions, but he was just a little kid.
So I just learned from you there was actually another child that I didn't know about. I didn't know a lot about the family because she'd left Toronto before I was born. I met her when I was a very young child, so I don't know a lot other than I didn't get super warm feelings, and I knew about her accident. The relationship was her brother David was my grandfather, was my mother's father, and so that's how I knew about Andrea. Other than that, I've learned a lot more from Yards than I knew before.
The two women that she traveled with through Ukraine in the car from Atlanta, one of them wrote a series of 8 articles that were published in the Chicago Tribune in 1933 about the same trip. And I was telling Ted that Rhea's only mentioned twice in it. One at the beginning, second article or something, they said that they needed somebody to go with them as a guide and interpreter, and the Soviets proposed somebody, and they said, no, we don't want a secret policeman. They said, well, the Soviet automobile agency will supply you. And he said, no, we don't want a secret policeman. And they knew about her, and so they asked for her, and then she writes, and that proved to be a mistake. And then the next reference to her is when she's kicked out, and just mentions that the OGPU came and arrested her, and this was not a surprise. I have a feeling it was like this woman was a kind of an alpha female, and certainly Rhea was an alpha female. She was not intimidated or whatever, and I have a feeling we can imagine in a car bouncing over these rag and ruts of roads that they traveled through and stuff like that. It must have been a hell of a grueling experience, and it's not surprising that she was really sick when they put her on the train back to Moscow.
I'd like to thank you very much for the story. I can hardly wait for the movie.
For those of you who came late, there's a handout that contains some of the information on her that you might find useful to have or interesting to have.
Just a reminder that at 6:30 there will be a presentation on Jews and Ukrainians, and we have one of the authors, Professor Maguchi, who's here, who will be speaking about this. Also, as you're leaving, you'll see a big banner that has pictures of food on it, and it shows the similarities between Ukrainian and Jewish foods, and there are pamphlets there if you'd like to take it, so it's near the exit door there. And if you want, we have hand sanitizers here for anybody who's
And who here is going to do the story of Rhea in Nazi Germany? Because I said that's a whole other chapter of her life that I think has got to be absolutely fascinating.